Slavery in Rome was not what we think. Masters could do whatever they wanted with their slaves, or could they? Imagine being trapped in a system where your life has no value, and your days depend on someone else's will. This was the reality for millions of people in Rome. But did you know that, although it seemed like a system without restrictions, there were limits, even if minimal, that masters could not cross? At one of the most opulent dinners in Rome, a slave made a mistake that condemned him to a brutal death. He broke a glass at a banquet hosted by Bedius Pollo. This mistake could have cost him his life, as Pollo ordered that he be thrown into a pond full of lampreys, creatures known for devouring human flesh. But at that very moment, Augustus, the emperor, intervened. Not only did he save the slave, but he also granted him freedom and ordered that all of the host's remaining glasses be broken as a symbolic punishment. But why did Augustus intervene? Was it really out of compassion? The story behind this decision reveals something much deeper about power in Rome and the limits that, although scarce, existed in the treatment of slaves. Don't leave, because what you'll discover today will change your perspective on Rome's slave system. Stay until the end to learn about the limits that, despite everything, masters could not cross. To understand the system of slavery in Rome, we have to go back to its origins. Slavery was not a recent practice when Rome was founded. In fact, it was so deeply rooted in society that even its mythical founder, Romulus, allowed citizens to sell their own children into slavery. So from the beginning, slavery was not just part of the economy, but an essential pillar of the Roman social structure. As Rome grew, so did slavery. From its humble beginnings as a small village, Rome began to expand rapidly, and with it, the number of war prisoners who became slaves. By the 5th century BCE, it is estimated that up to 20% of Rome's population was composed of slaves. This dependence on slavery not only drove the Roman economy, but it also transformed the daily life of its citizens. In the early times, slavery had a more domestic and personal character, with masters working side by side with their slaves in the fields or at home. But over time, slavery became industrialized and massified, losing the personal connection that existed between masters and slaves. What began as a more or less equitable relationship, where the master saw the slave almost as a member of the family, turned into brutal exploitation. Slaves ceased to be individuals with personal stories and became nothing more than numbers in the large mansions and fields of Rome. As Rome advanced in its conquests, the system of slavery began to change drastically. At first, as we mentioned, slaves were a small part of the population and their work was more personal, almost familial. The masters were not only owners, but also shared part of their daily lives with the slaves, in some cases working alongside them in the fields or in domestic tasks. However, as Rome expanded, that relationship changed. Slaves arrived in large numbers, especially with military conquests. They were no longer just individual prisoners but large groups brought from distant lands, people stripped of their identity and transformed into property. Slavery ceased to be a familial relationship and became a machinery of mass exploitation, where slaves were treated as numbers, as economic resources, not as human beings. The increase in the slave population also changed the master's perception. If before, a slave was someone they knew, assigned a specific task within the household or farm, now impersonality reigned. The slave was no longer seen as a member of the community or family but simply a tool for labor, a commodity that could be bought and sold. This change also had important consequences. As there were so many slaves, it became harder to control their escapes. In early Rome, if a slave escaped, they could easily hide in nearby villages or among enemy tribes. However, over time, slaves were crammed into huge villas and fields. Cities grew, and opportunities for escape diminished considerably. Freedom became an even more distant concept, and masters no longer feared their slaves running away as much. As slavery became institutionalized in Rome, the brutality of masters toward their slaves became almost inevitable. With no real laws protecting slaves, masters had total freedom to inflict whatever punishments they desired. Beatings, forced labor, torture, mutilations, violence was the norm, not the exception. Slaves were property, and like any other tool, they could be discarded when they were no longer useful. However, despite the ruthless nature of this system, Roman society was not completely indifferent to extreme violence. There were certain social norms and some laws, although limited and rarely enforced, that tried to curb the most blatant abuses. One of the figures responsible for trying to control this disorder was the censor. This magistrate had the authority to intervene in cases of extreme cruelty toward slaves, but their role was not mandatory, rather discretionary. Only if a free citizen reported an abuse could the censor act. And although they could theoretically intervene to prevent abuse, the practice was different. In more than 400 years of Republican history, there are no records of censors defending a single slave. Sometimes, the only protection slaves had was social judgment. If a master went too far in their treatment, the community could look at them with disapproval. But that was a very vague response, offering no real guarantee for slaves. However, even in this brutal system, sometimes cases arose where the violence reached such a degree of scandal that Roman society could not turn a blind eye. One of the most notable examples occurred during the reign of Emperor Augustus, who intervened in a case that, while reflecting the cruelty inherent in the system, also showed that, on occasion, the power of Rome could be used to correct the excesses of its elites. The case involved a slave who, during a banquet organized by the Roman knight Bedius Pollo, accidentally broke a glass. Enraged, Pollo ordered the slave to be thrown into a pond full of lampreys, creatures that devour human flesh. However, Augustus, who was present at the banquet, made an unexpected decision. Not only did he save the slave, but he also granted him freedom and, as a symbolic punishment, ordered all the remaining glasses of the host to be broken. This episode, although extraordinary, shows how the power of an emperor could intervene to limit abuse. But it was not an act of compassion, rather a public lesson on the abuse of power. For Augustus, the message was clear: even the powerful had to adhere to certain rules. However, these cases were exceptional, and the vast majority of abuses against slaves were never sanctioned. Over time, some laws began to emerge, not out of morality, but rather due to the need to avoid social disorder. A mistreated slave with no hope of escape represented a ticking time bomb, and slave rebellions like Spartacus demonstrated that Rome had to do something to prevent the system from collapsing. One of the first laws to intervene was the Lex Petronia, passed in 61 CE, which prohibited slaves from being sent to die in the amphitheaters at the hands of beasts without prior authorization from a magistrate. The law sought to curb public punishments used as private entertainment. The state wanted to monopolize public violence, not let any aristocrat become an executioner for fun. In parallel, contractual clauses began to emerge, which, although not aimed at protecting the human rights of slaves, did limit what masters could do in certain circumstances. One of the best-known clauses was the ne prostituto, which explicitly prohibited forcing a slave woman into prostitution. If the new master violated this clause, the slave had to be immediately freed and recognized as a freed woman. These clauses, although seemingly progressive, were not driven by a desire for social justice. In many cases, they were used to protect the economic interests or reputation of the family or the owner. For example, a former owner could impose the clause to avoid a public scandal, not because it was a moral issue. Although these measures were symbolic and limited, they showed that, even in the most brutal system, the law could, in some way, intervene to prevent total chaos. However, the majority of the time, the treatment of slaves still depended on the temperament of the master. A slave's life could be as unpredictable as the character of their owner. Despite all the laws and limitations that Imperial Rome attempted to implement over time, the truth is that these measures only became symbolic. It was not about recognizing the dignity of slaves as human beings, but about avoiding social disorder and the instability that could arise from a dissatisfied and uncontrolled slave population. With emperors like Antoninus Pius and Constantine, Rome took some steps toward recognizing that even slaves had value beyond the economic. For example, the law of Antoninus Pius in 161 CE prohibited the unjust killing of slaves, meaning that a master who deliberately killed their slave had to face the same sanctions as if they had killed a free person. This was a sign that, although limited, slaves were beginning to have some legal protection. However, even with these measures, the system never recognized the true humanity of slaves. Most abuses were never sanctioned, and only if the violence reached levels so public or scandalous that it affected public order would the state intervene. This meant that the vast majority of slaves lived and died without anyone caring about their conditions. Ultimately, slavery in Rome was not just about oppression, but about a deeply rooted economic and social issue. Rome built its wealth and power on the backs of millions of slaves, and although, over time, some emperors tried to curb the most visible abuses, the system as a whole never stopped viewing slaves as mere property. So, the next time you hear that in Rome, masters could not do whatever they wanted with their slaves, remember this: the limits did exist, yes, but they were weak, symbolic, and almost always unnecessary. It was not about protecting the humanity of slaves, but about maintaining the stability of a system that relied on their exploitation.